On the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Robert Gordon Menzies announced the beginning of Australia's involvement in the Second World War on every national and commercial radio station in Australia.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
At the time, the Swan Hill district in the northwest Victorian Mallee area on the Murray River was surrounded by thriving rural communities. It serviced agricultural industries including dryland cropping, viticulture, orchards and dairy. These communities included Lake Boga, Ultima, Weichi, Chinkapook, Nyah, Nyah West, Robinvale, Menangatang, Boundary Bend, Piangle, Beverford, Woodward, Tresco, Coolanong, and many small communities in between. During some of the driest years on record, dust storms became a regular experience, blocking out the sunlight and covering roads. Still recovering from the Great Depression, the Swan Hill area provided many sporting clubs, including football, tennis, cricket, croquet, bowls and swimming at the new baths beside Riverside Park. The new Swan Hill Town Hall was built and included the Regent Theatre, where Hollywood films featured regularly. While the rugged condition of the road leading to Swan Hill limited visitors, the well-established railway service continued to be a popular mode of transportation for people and goods, ultimately leading to the demise of the paddleboat industry, which had serviced Swan Hill since the 1850s. With the outbreak of war in 1939, there were changes around the district. In 1938, Lake Boga was noted as a potential site for flying boat activity by the Australian government. When Japanese bombers attacked Darwin and Broome in 1942, resulting in the loss of 16 aircraft, the establishment of a safe haven for flying boats was required inland as a remote facility outside the sphere of Japanese airplanes. Lake Boga was selected as it allowed almost unlimited choice of landing and takeoff directions and was free of obstructions. It was also close to nearby infrastructure. Commissioned in June 1942, the No. 1 Flying Boat Repair and Service Depot was set up to provide the repair and servicing requirements of the flying boats. Facilities constructed at the base included workshops and hangars on the foreshore, a stores area, living quarters, sick quarters at Castle Donington, a first aid and dental post, and a radio transmission station. Flying boats serviced, repaired or rebuilt during the operation of the base were PBY Catalina, Dornier Doe 24, OS2U Kingfisher, Short Sunderland, Supermarine Walrus and Martin Mariner. Officially, 1,050 aircraft arrivals and departures occurred. They would return to northern bases to conduct long-range patrols, anti-shipping and rescue missions, and an estimated 800 test flights were conducted during the 5 years the base was in operation. At the height of the war, 39 officers, 802 airmen, and 102 Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force members were based in Lake Boga. Despite all this activity, it was also classed as a top-secret base. As the war ramped up, men and women from all over the Swan Hill district came forward to do their bit for the war effort. John Gerard McMahon, known as Jack, was born in Ultima in 1924. He was the eldest son of a family of 5 children. On finishing school, he worked for the Postal Service in Melbourne. After turning 18, he joined the Royal Australian Air Force on the 15th of January 1943 and went into training at the Williams Base in Point Cook, Victoria.
I had always dreamed of being a pilot. When war broke out, I knew that I would be called up the moment I turned 18. So I decided to beat them to it and enlisted with the Air Force. My instructor said, "McMahon, you're going to kill yourself." My flying instructor never thought too much of me. Even so, I still managed to get my wings at the age of 18 years and 5 months.
While training to fly the de Havilland 82 Tiger Moth and the Airspeed Oxford planes, Jack spent time on bases at Somers and Benalla before heading back to Point Cook to conclude his training.
I travelled from Point Cook to Brisbane, to San Francisco, then New York, where I boarded a ship that would take me to Britain.
On the 1st of March 1944, after a fortnight in Sydney, Jack embarked from Brisbane and arrived in Brighton, England on the 4th of April. On arrival, Jack was one of 6 young Australian pilots selected to do an operational course on the de Havilland Mosquito planes. These were a British-designed twin-engine, 2-seat bomber aircraft that was adapted to become the prime night fighter of the Allies during World War II. The Mosquito had a frame of wood and a skin of plywood, and were made in England, Australia and Canada.
In my time, I would fly Airspeed Oxfords, Wellingtons and Blenheims, but the best aircraft I would fly would be the Mosquito. Some officer had said to me, "I hear you're a very good pilot." "I wouldn't think so, sir." "Well, your instructor said you were." "Well, he didn't tell me." It was a beautiful plane, made from timber, and it was marvellous to fly. Nothing would compare with the feeling I got from flying that plane.
Jack then joined the No. 456 Mosquito Squadron. This was the Australian Air Force's only dedicated night fighter squadron in the Second World War. In February 1944, after being re-equipped with Mosquitoes possessing more powerful radar, 456 Squadron began operations against German bombers making night attacks against London. They were well equipped for stalking German bombers in Britain's night skies, but they were also very useful in daylight hours as well. In the month following the Normandy landings, 456 Squadron met with outstanding success over France, destroying 13 bombers. From late 1944 until the end of the war, 456 Squadron continued its Ranger missions over Germany, attacking airfields in support of Bomber Command, as well as other targets of opportunity. Jack professed himself as being very proud to be part of an elite squadron, later stating in an interview, "They were the best planes I ever flew. You knew damned well if you didn't keep yourself mentally alert, you'd be shot down."
On and off the ground, when training or in combat, it was always an adventure. Being a pilot was a challenge. We were all there for the same reason, to do our best and help win the war.
On the 15th of June 1945, 456 Squadron disbanded and Jack returned to Australian soil soon after. On Jack's return home, he went back to work in Melbourne for the Postmaster General, where he met his future wife Pat. After they were married in 1950, he and Pat moved back to Swan Hill, where Jack continued working as a technician for the PMG and Telecom. Together they had 8 children, but sadly in 1968 Pat passed away from breast cancer at only 43. Jack remained working at Telecom as well as raising his young family alone until they all left home. As a single parent, Jack became very community minded and devoted much time to Legacy Swan Hill for over 35 years. He was also very involved with the RSL, the Jockey Club and various other organisations in Swan Hill. Jack was Group Chairman of Swan Hill Legacy in 1992 and 93. He was a mentor to younger legatees from when they first joined and right through their careers through Legacy. Jack was the Legacy Badge Week coordinator for over 20 years, arranging for the distribution of badges to outlying districts, as well as organising school students to assist with the tin rattle. He also pitched in to help sell Anzac badges and remembrance poppies, as well as visiting RSL members whether sick in hospital or at home. In 2008, Jack was chosen as one of 16 veterans to represent World War II personnel at the Anzac Day AFL match at the MCG. In front of a crowd of 90,000 people, Jack travelled around the ground in a convertible, proudly waving an Australian flag. In an interview for an article appearing in the Football Record that day, he told the reporter, "Before you start, pal, I'm just an ordinary citizen, no big noter. He was 86 years old when he was awarded a life membership of the Return Services League in 2010, after almost half a century of volunteering. Jack remained very active until he moved to Altrincham Care Home in Swan Hill, where he passed away peacefully in his 90th year. John Muir Williams, known as Jack, was born at Swan Hill in May 1919 to Ernest Spencer and Jessie Ellen Williams. The family lived for a short period at 103 Beveridge Street before moving into their newly built Federation-styled home at 331 Beveridge Street. Ernest, a prosperous man with a social awareness, owned and ran a drapery business called E. Williams Men's Mercer, located on the west side of Campbell Street, one shop from the White Swan Hotel. Jack attended the local schools and in 1933 became a boarder at Wesley College in Melbourne. After finishing school, he returned to Swan Hill, where he began working for his father in the drapery business. During this time, he was courting his soon-to-be wife, Kathleen Rose Kruger, known as Rose, with whom he had been friends since childhood. In January 1939, Jack enlisted in the army at Bendigo and joined the 17th Machine Gun Regiment, but 1 year later he transferred to the RAAF. On February 3rd, 1941, Jack was posted to the 2nd Initial Training School at Linfield, Sydney, and on March 29th the same year, at Linfield Methodist Church, he married his Swan Hill sweetheart, Rose. He was also classified as a leading air crewman, and then officially assigned as air crew around the same time. On the 28th of May, Jack was posted to the 8th Elementary Training School at Narrandera, New South Wales. The course involved initial pupil training in the de Havilland Tiger Moth, a very stable biplane first produced in 1931. It was the primary RAAF and Royal Air Force elementary trainer of World War II and was a dual cockpit aircraft, with the instructor sitting behind the pupil. Finally, on June 13th, Jack shipped out as part of the Empire Training Air Scheme, bound for Canada. This was a more advanced course, specifically for training Commonwealth air crew as either fighter pilots or bomber crew for war operations. Jack was now officially seconded or on loan to the Royal Canadian Air Force. Jack's family were not informed of his destination in this training scheme, hence Rose did not know where he was bound. Helpfully, Jack took along his small box brownie camera and documented his journey to New Zealand, Fiji and on to Canada, sending her images and postcards along his route. Jack received his wings, or pilot's licence, on September 25th and was promoted to sergeant pilot. He sent Rose a telegram with the words, "Wings today, love," to let her know of his achievement. Upon arrival in Canada, Jack was registered at the No. 7 Service Flying Training School of the Royal Canadian Air Force in Alberta. From here, Jack attended 2 operational training units and was promoted again to flight sergeant. He even managed trips to the Rocky Mountains and to Niagara Falls, all documented and notated with his camera. After 10 months of training in Canada, Jack shipped out to England on the 11th of August, 1942. Arriving in December, he was assigned to the 75th New Zealand Squadron, based at Newmarket Heath. The 75 were a specialty night bombing squadron and were composed of pilots and aircrew from many Allied countries. Jack joined the crew of a Sterling III bomber and commenced his missions almost immediately. His first mission took place on the 27th of January 1943. This operation was to drop mines off the coast of Terschelling, Germany. 2 Sterling bombers were assigned this mission and both reported that their 1,500-pound payloads, sometimes called vegetables, were delivered and the parachutes were seen to open, though visibility was poor. On this mission and all subsequent missions, Jack Williams is listed as Air Bomber, more frequently called the Bomb Aimer. His role was to man the nose-mounted gun turret during the operation and provide assistance to the navigator, only to crawl into the bomb aimer's compartment in the lower section of the nose of the aircraft to operate the bomb sight and press the button to release the bomb load onto the target at the necessary time. Between the end of January and the 26th of April 1943, Jack and his crew flew 18 missions. These included mining off the Frisian Islands and in the Gironde estuary, as well as targeted land bombing attacks at Lorient, Nuremberg, Cologne, St. Nazaire, Berlin, Munich, Essen, Kiel, Duisburg, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Ludwigshafen and Rostock. But on the 28th of April 1943, 8 aircraft were detailed to drop 1,500 pounds of mines in Kiel Bay in the north of Germany. One of these aircraft returned early owing to its compass being faulty, and 4 failed to return at all. Navigational problems caused by low cloud cover around the target area forced many of the bombers down to a dangerously low altitude, making them easy targets for flak anti-aircraft batteries. Flying on a westerly course, Jack's bomber passed directly over the Kapell gun emplacement at an approximate height of 300 metres. The aircraft and battery briefly exchanged fire, and the right inboard engine of the Stirling began to burn, bringing the plane down. At 8 minutes past midnight, Jack's Stirling Bf467 crashed into the sea off the west coast of Lolland, southern Denmark. None of the crew members survived. Jack's body washed ashore the same day, followed by the remaining crew in the weeks after. They were all laid to rest in the Svinø churchyard in Denmark. Jack's headstone reads, "John, beloved husband of Rose." Rose kept the telegrams, first informing her that her husband was missing and then of his death. She was the recipient of his effects from England, which included his camera and photos, which she arranged with all the memorabilia he had collected into an album. She did eventually marry again and had children, but always fondly remembered her beloved boy, Jack. Rose passed away in 2016 at almost 99. Every year, on the 4th of May, Danes gather at the churchyard to honour the fallen Allied airmen. A service is held and candles are lit on each grave to honour the men who rest there. On the home front, women dealt with the consequences of war, managing children and family responsibilities alone, fundraising and sending care packages to troops, shortages of resources, as well as their fears for the future and the grief and trauma of losing loved ones. In World War II, women were actively recruited, serving in the 3 Corps services, and formed a large component of the labour force, releasing men for active service from munitions, shipbuilding and aircraft works, factories, farms, commerce, transport and communications. Marguerite Ellen Roberts, better known as Daisy, was born on the 25th of November 1919 in Birmingham, England. By the time she was 3 months old, her mother had died of pneumonia. Daisy, her older sister and their father lived with her maternal grandparents until Daisy was 7, when her grandmother died. Her father, James, had previously lived in Broken Hill and was desperate to return. He met and married a young woman named Charlotte, and then the family decided to move to Australia, where Daisy was 10 years of age. After moving to a small house in Richmond, James had trouble finding a job as it was the middle of the Great Depression. Eventually he found one at Maribyrnong, so Daisy and her sister attended public school there. After leaving school and having several jobs in the clothing industry, Daisy went back to school to learn shorthand and typing at Xero's Business College for 6 months. Following this, the war had started and Daisy decided to join the Australian Women's Army Service. Australia's Minister for the Army considered women to be an underutilised resource in Australia's war effort. Consequently, He approved the formation of the AWAS on the 13th of August 1941, with the objective of releasing more men into forward areas. Members of the AWAS took on roles such as drivers, provos, canteen workers, cooks, typists, signallers and cipher clerks. In 2010, at 90 years of age, Daisy wrote a memoir of her life and detailed her time in the AWAS.
I joined the Army, AWAS, in July 1943 and did my rookie's course in Dali. It was mighty frosty when we had to line up for roll call, early in the morning, in the dark, but we survived. It was a bit confusing at first. Every time the whistle blew, I had to think, did I have to put on shorts for PT? Or grab a hat and coat for a route march? Or notebook and pen for a lecture? But I soon learned, and the training was good for me. After rookies, I did an admin course and then worked at 2 BOD Queen Street for a few weeks at a typing pool, till one day I was summoned to the Commandant's office and wondered what I had done wrong, but he just asked me if I was willing to go anywhere, to which I said, "Yes, sir." Then he told me to follow the sergeant, and she would take me out to Camp Pal, where I would get all my tropical gear and needles. Then I would get overnight leave, and I was to be at Spencer Street Station to catch the overnight train to Adelaide, which all sounded pretty exciting. There were 6 of us all assembled at the station, all wondering where we were going to be sent, thinking we must be going up through the centre to Darwin, or even New Guinea. We all piled into a dog box carriage with our kit bags and cases and things, all squashed along the seats, with our sore arms from the needles, and our army blankets wrapped around us right down to our ankles. Off we went. We spent 2 days in Adelaide, waiting for our transport for up north, and eventually were taken up to Quorn and boarded the old Garn. We travelled for 4 days on the Garn, when it suddenly pulled up in the middle of the night, just outside of Heavy Tree Gap. Security officers came aboard and told us we had reached our destination, Alice Springs. They checked our papers as we chuffed into the station and told each one of us which section of the army we were assigned to. Then we all piled into the Blitz buggy that was waiting for us and were taken to the AWAS barracks, where the girls had apparently been waiting for us. Doors of huts opened and girls came running out in their pretty dressing gowns to welcome us and have a chat over a cup of tea in the mess. Each morning we got up early and did our washing, starched and ironed our uniform, working dresses, before breakfast. Then we had to go on parade for inspection before going to our destined places of work. Mickey and I worked at headquarters, which was an old house in the middle of Todd Street, commonly known as the Castle, where the Brigadier and all the pips and red tape worked, and all the other girls were destined to their different sectors of the men's camp at the foot of Anzac Hill. We Victorians were replacing all the South Australian girls that had been there for 12 months, and we soon learnt the duties we were responsible for, all being typists. Alice Springs was a very important place after the bombing of Darwin, as it had been made the capital of the territory, and was mainly the staging camp for the trucks going up and down the track, carting supplies to Darwin of all that they needed. We grew to love the old Alice, with the beautiful McDonald Ranges surrounding it like a basin. We were instructed to call the Aboriginals natives, and we respected them and they respected us, and we never had any trouble. We could hear them having their corroborees in the dry bed of the Todd River sometimes, but no one ever infringed on their privacy. We worked 6 days a week, but were allowed to go on picnics on Sunday after church parade. 2 concerts were organised, in which I took part in the sketches and ballet, etc., and was even half of the sawn-in-half lady. There was a stage for concerts at the foot of a steep slope, where rows of logs were secured for people to sit on. When VE Day came, some of us went over to the hospital and put on a little sort of concert on the move. We would do a little sketch in one ward, and then go into the next ward and do it all again, followed by whatever came after us. The patients enjoyed it all, and they knew that they were not forgotten. A lot of changes had taken place, and of course we were still at war with Japan. Darwin still needed a lot of help, with trucks carting stuff up from Adelaide and trying to get the town back to normal again. Margaret and I were the first to be sent south. It was a sad day when all the gang came to see us off on the old Garn, We were both transferred to a small arms school in Bongilla, where we worked in the office till the end of the war. My friend Audrey Chamberlain and I decided to volunteer to go to Japan with the Army of Occupation, and so we were transferred to join the Australian Army Medical Women's Service in order to do so. We joined as typists, but in the AAMWS, you must be prepared to do whatever you're asked to do, and even had tracksuits issued in case of having to help in an emergency of any kind. I was in an office with 6 others. We were stationed at Concord Military Hospital to await the arrival of our ship to Japan. Audrey and I used to go around the hospital sometimes in the evenings and talk to the patients. After I had been at Concord for about a month, an urgent telegram came for me to say that my father was very ill and I must come home. I got compassionate leave, came home and got out of the army, and my father died the next day after I got to see him. I didn't like the civvy life, missed all my friends, but you have to just start again and do the best you can, and my life goes on. I kept in touch with all the special friends I went up to Alice Springs with, and now there are only 2 of us left, Mickey and I. I finished up going to Naya to visit Margaret and married her brother in 1948. I have a lovely family. From 2 children, I have 6 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. Happy ending, happy memories, and happy days yet to come.
Daisy is now 100 years old and resides at Jacaranda Lodge Nursing Home at Naya West. When the Second World War broke out, nurses again volunteered. Eventually, some 5,000 Australian nurses served in a variety of locations, including the Middle East, the Mediterranean, Britain, Asia, the Pacific, and Australia. 78 lost their lives, some through accident or illness, but mostly as a result of enemy action or while prisoners of war. At first, the Australian Army Nursing Service was the only women's service, later followed by the formation of the Royal Australian Air Force Nursing Service and the Royal Australian Navy Nursing Service. The AANS remained by far the largest nursing service and also made up the bulk of those who served overseas. By the end of the war, the Royal Australian Air Force Nursing Service included 616 members. This was many more than at its founding in July 1940. By December that year, it had only 45 members. 37-year-old Evelyn Allen Ward was one of those 45 nurses. Evelyn had previously spent 4 years training at Swan Hill Hospital, where she received glowing assessments. Completing her training there in January 1936, she then moved to St Ives Hospital in East Melbourne until deciding to sign up with the RAAFNS. Matrons from both hospitals wrote references for Evelyn, one describing her as one of the best nurses it has been my pleasure to know. She's a keen and willing worker with a quiet manner and even temper. On signing up on the 22nd of August 1940, Evelyn was ranked as a staff nurse, but within 2 years had been promoted 4 times to senior sister. Her record states that she was the first RAAF sister to escort a draft of Empire Air trainees to Canada for their special flight training. Then, following appointments at different Australian hospitals, including Ascot Vale RAAF Hospital and the No. 3 Medical Receiving Station at Townsville, Evelyn embarked for Port Moresby in New Guinea on the 22nd of August 1943. Posted to the No. 8 Medical Rehabilitation Unit at Sageri, she was appointed the sister in charge. By December, all 50 beds were filled with patients, and the unit expanded by another 25 beds a month later. Red Cross personnel visited weekly to help with occupational therapy. Rehabilitated men were either rejoined to their units or sent back to Australia nearing the end of the war. Evelyn later received an Associate of the Red Cross award for her work at Sageri. This award is made to a fully trained nurse of an officially recognised nursing service, military or civilian, who has shown exceptional devotion and competence in the performance of nursing duties over a continuous and long period, or who has performed an exceptional act of bravery and devotion at her or his post of duty. The citation reads, "As a sister in charge of the unit since its inception, she has displayed special devotion to duty and competency in the performance of her nursing duties. By her untiring work, cheerfulness and tact, Senior Sister Ward has been largely responsible for the success of the unit and for the speedy return of the patients to duty. She rendered exceptionally meritorious service." After 10 months of rehabilitating the sick and injured, Evelyn returned to Australian soil on the 22nd of April 1944. Shortly after returning, she was promoted to matron and became the principal nursing officer for the RAAFNS in Queensland for the next 2 years. Evelyn left the RAAFNS in March 1946 and returned to the Swan Hill Hospital later the same year, where she became matron. She is remembered fondly by other hospital staff, who say she was an excellent nurse and very well liked at the hospital, going by the nickname Wardy. She resigned as matron of the hospital in June 1952, but continued as matron of midwifery until around 1968. She married late in life to Robert Masters, but they did not have any children. Evelyn was awarded BPW Woman of the Year in Swan Hill in 1975, and not long after moved back to Melbourne, settling in Heidelberg. On the 18th of August 1995, she passed away at the age of 92. Mark James O'Brien started out life at Nandaly, near Lake Tyrrell, in August 1917. He attended school from age 4 at Nyarran for 2 years, before the family moved to Speed, 35 kilometres west of Nandaly. This was their home for another 2 years until moving to St Kilda. Mark had to adjust from a school of 30 students to a new school with hundreds of pupils. Later in life, Mark wrote his life story and described his schooling life in St Kilda.
That's when homework started, and that's when I started hating school, and often played the wag, as it was called in those days. I'd get a job such as selling or delivering papers around St Kilda. I would start a paper round at 5 or 6 and work until school time. And if I was a bit late, then I'd stay away from school for the day. Needless to say, I didn't get much education for schoolwork, but I did learn a lot on how to survive. And this was very handy in later life.
Mark didn't like city life, so after reaching 6th grade, he left school at age 11. This was during the Depression, and there were many people looking for work in the city. So together with his older brother, who was 13, Mark headed back to the country.
At the time of so many out of work, the then government were creating jobs for the unemployed. One of these jobs was a bridge and railway line crossing the Murray River at Yarrawonga. So we headed for there. After walking and getting rides for 3 days, we arrived at Yarrawonga to find a big tent city along the riverbank. We tried for days, but we were told we were too young, and married men had the first preference of all the jobs. In those days there was no dole or handouts from the government, so we had to manage the best we could. And to do that, we caught fish from the river and trapped rabbits and sold them in the shops and houses in the town, earning enough money to buy a tent and some rabbit traps.
Mark and his brother made their own living at Yarrawonga until the bridge was finished and all the workers moved on. So at only 13, Mark set off with all that he could carry to the Hume Weir. He found his father in a camp of workers who were constructing the railway around the weir, but was again told he was too young to get a job. So once again he hunted for rabbits and fished, selling his haul to the camps. After 2 years, the weir and the railway were finished and work dried up again. So this time, he decided to go back to the Mallee.
By this time the Depression was nearly over, and the times were starting to improve. So at the age of 15 years, I arrived back at Chinkapook. I got a job on a wheat farm for my keep, which meant you were supplied your meals and some place to sleep, usually the back of an old stripper, as it was only used on the farm for about a month of the year at harvest time. The work was mainly driving about 8 heavy horses in a team, either ploughing, cropping or harvesting.
With time and experience, Mark was able to start earning wages, as well as his keep, on the farms in the Mallee. Eventually, on turning 19, Mark had the opportunity to share farm with a local landowner. Things started out nicely, with the wheat growing to 4 inches before a lack of water killed the entire crop. Out of work again, he decided to try his luck back in the city.
So after many years away from home, I visited my mother, who then lived in Brunswick. While there, I tried to get work, but as I had no trade, it was impossible. There was only one thing to do. I put my age back to 17 years and applied for an apprenticeship as a men's hairdresser and got it.
For the next couple of years, Mark did well as a men's hairdresser and supplemented his income with other jobs on the side, managing to save money as well as purchase a motorbike. Some weekends he took the train to Chincook and attended the dances with the girl he was sweet on, Anne. By this time it was 1939 and the war had started.
As I was still serving my apprenticeship, I was unable to leave my job until I had served a certain time. So as soon as the time was up, I joined the army in 1940 and put my age back to its right place of 22 years. I joined in the morning and by that night, with others who had joined at the same time, arrived at Wangaratta Showground and started my army training the next day. For the next few weeks, I found army life quite to my liking.
Mark took part in training at Wangaratta from June until September 1940, when they moved to Bongilla Camp. In October, they were granted their final week of leave before departing, so he headed back to Chincook to see his family and his sweetheart, Anne, one more time.
Arrived back at camp 2 days late and was afraid that I might have missed out on leaving with my unit, but I was just in time as the whole unit was packed ready to move. I climbed aboard the nearest truck and I was away on time, and by that night I was on board the biggest boat I had ever seen, the Strathmore, my home for the next few weeks. November the 17th, we were off to the war. I was lucky enough to be in the first-class cabin, which had been fitted out with 2 extra beds and shared with 3 of my mates, having been together since the first day in the army.
The Strathmore made its way through the Indian Ocean to Colombo in Sri Lanka and up through the Suez Canal. Mark used his room as a barber shop, and his earnings kept himself and his bunkmates in beer for the trip. Finally, on the 17th of December, they disembarked at what was then called Kantara, now named El Quantar, and boarded trains for Palestine.
Unknown to us, the Australian 6th Division had moved into Egypt and met the Italian army and had pushed them back quite a bit. As soon as we were ready, we were moved into Egypt, and there my war really started. Mostly air raids at first, bombing and strafing as we moved further up the coast. In February 1941, the 6th Division was withdrawn and re-equipped to go to Greece. Leaving our division plus the British and Indian units to carry on, until this time we had been fighting the Italian army and doing quite well. But now we were starting to fight the Germans, who were equipped with heavy armour like we had never met before, and we took quite a hammering and had to retreat to a place called Tobruk. There we were cut off from everywhere but the sea. We dug in and formed a perimeter all around for the next 7 months. We lined and fought nearly every day to survive. Our air force had disappeared, and the German planes bombed us every day, but survive we did. After 7 months of that, we were ordered to be ready to move, taking no more than what we stood in, plus our rifles and 50 rounds of ammo. We marched down to the harbour in pitch darkness, and there, amongst all the sunken ships and wrecked buildings, beside the wharf, was a naval destroyer, and we walked straight on board, and before we knew it, we moved out into the open sea. Daylight next morning, and we were delighted to see how many destroyers were lined up with troops heading for Alexandria. The siege of Tobruk was over.
Between April and August 1941, around 14,000 Australian soldiers were besieged in Tobruk by the German and Italian armies. The defenders of Tobruk did not surrender. They did not retreat. Their determination, bravery and humour, combined with the aggressive tactics of their commanders, become a source of inspiration during some of the war's darkest days. In so doing, they achieved lasting fame as the Rats of Tobruk. From Alexandria, Mark was taken back to camp near Gaza and then, having found his brother alive after getting news he had been killed, he transferred to the 6th Division to be close to him. They moved from the heat of the desert up to the snow in Syria, where they stayed for a few months. Then they boarded another ship and were sent back to Colombo to link up with other troop ships. The Japanese had just ended the war, and the morning after Mark's division arrived in Colombo, the port was hit by Japanese bombers.
100 Japanese bombers in waves of 20 every hour for 5 hours. A lot of damage was done at the harbour and a number of Jap planes were shot down. As some of our ships were damaged, we were unloaded and marched inland some distance and set up our camp.
The next 3 months were spent jungle training before the division was moved back to Australia under total secrecy. The men were not allowed to call or write to anyone to let them know that they had arrived back on home soil. A secret camp was set up somewhere along the Murray River. Mark and his brother managed to sneak out one night and found a tiny country pub across the river, where they spent the night drinking beer.
We arrived back at camp just before daylight, with as much beer as we could carry. That night we produced 12 bottles of beer in the tent and had our first party back in the Australian soil. Next day we were visited by nearly every soldier in the camp to find out where the beer had come from.
When they were given 2 weeks' leave, Mark headed to Chincopuc and became engaged to Anne, then headed down to Melbourne to visit his mother before the division headed up to Brisbane. The American forces had a large base there at the time, and one night huge brawls erupted when Mark's mate was stabbed during a fight with an American soldier and passed away from his wounds. Large groups of Americans and Australians roamed the streets fighting, and the American canteen was burned to the ground. Before the military police could come looking for the instigators, they were all loaded onto ships, sailing down the Brisbane River, heading for New Guinea on the 31st of October 1942. Arriving in Milne Bay, half of the unit was flown onto Port Moresby, and Mark's half was flown to an inland airfield called Wau.
By the time we arrived at the airfield, the Japs were already moving onto the lower end of the airstrip, so we were coming under fire in the planes before we'd even landed. The transport planes landed, and while they were turning around, we bundled out to the ground and had to dive for any cover we could find and make our way off the airstrip into surrounding jungle as best we could, then form up into our proper units. Some never got off the airstrip. After 15 or so planes had come and gone, we had enough troops to hold the Japs where they were. That night was a nightmare.
They managed to hold the airstrip for the night, and come morning they found that the Japanese troops had pulled back and dug in back in the jungle. Reinforcements arrived, and Mark's unit received 2 days' rest before continuing forward for the next 10 to 12 months, pushing the Japanese all the way back to Salamoa on the north coast of New Guinea. Then, during a heavy counter-attack from the Japanese, Mark's luck, which had held for the whole war so far, gave out. He was shot twice, once in the face and once in the shoulder. He walked out with the other wounded to be picked up by a barge and taken to an airfield, where he was then evacuated to hospital at Port Moresby.
5 days after I was wounded, I was admitted, fly-blown, rotten with malaria, and weighing 9 stone, 4 stones lighter than when I had arrived months earlier. The next few weeks were pretty hectic for me. Until this time I had not seen my face, as it was bandaged over both eyes.
Several trips in and out of theatre eventually started Mark's jaw healing, though he felt sick when he managed to sneak a peek in the mirror one day when the bandages were off. He soon realised that he was very lucky, as there were many in the hospital who were not as fortunate. As soon as he started to heal, Mark was sent home to Australia on a hospital ship, arriving in Brisbane in October 1943, almost a year after leaving for New Guinea. He was then sent to Victoria via a hospital train. Arriving in Melbourne, Mark was taken straight to hospital, where he could only be fed with liquid as his jaw was still wired shut. Once the jaw had healed enough, another operation was performed to remove the wire and fix the wound as best as the doctors could. Mark suffered through 2 more operations before he was discharged and allowed to eat normal food again. He was given 28 days leave before he was due to rejoin his unit, still in New Guinea.
During my home leave, Anne and I decided to get married, and after a very short honeymoon, was back in an army camp, Bonegilla Staging Camp. From there, I was to go back to my unit in New Guinea. But it wasn't to be. As the first night in camp, I was informed that the major in charge of the camp had sent for me. To my surprise, he was one of my former officers, also wounded in New Guinea. He told me I was going nowhere if he had anything to say, and apparently he did. I was transported back to Melbourne, and after about a week, my discharge came through. I was given a suit of clothes, a rail pass to Chinkipook, and away I went.
Mark returned to Chinkipook to join his new wife, and they had 4 children. They owned several successful farms in the area and closer to Swan Hill.
So now I have 4 children, 10 grandchildren, a wife, a nice little farm and a few horses, and I live in Australia. What more could I want? I wouldn't want it any other way.
Mark passed away in 2008 at the age of 90. Mario Takasika enlisted in the AIF at the Melbourne Town Hall on the 11th of July 1940. This was 5 months after the death of his father, Joe Takasika, the pioneer of rice growing in Australia. Joe migrated with his wife and 2 children to Australia from Japan in 1905. At this time, Japanese people immigrating around the world were referred to as Nikkei migrants and later as Nikkei Australians. Together with the Victorian government, Joe started his rice growing experiments at Naya and Tintinda West. Born in Swan Hill in 1910, Mario was the youngest member of the family and the only one born in Australia. At the time of his arrival, Mario's family lived in a small cottage measuring only 15 by 18 feet. After 20 years of struggling to grow a decent rice crop through drought, flood and a locust plague, the Takasikas abandoned rice and turned their attention to vine growing. In 1939, Joe went back to his hometown, Matsuyama, in Japan, apparently to raise funds for his next venture, leaving his family behind. He unexpectedly passed away in Japan on February 15th, 1940, from heart disease. By the time he decided to enlist, Mario was living at Fosterville, near Bendigo, with his brother Sho, cultivating a tomato orchard. He tried to enlist in Bendigo twice, but was rejected under Australian military regulations and Orders number 177. This applied the White Australia policy to the armed forces and excluded recruits who were not of substantially European origin. However, his application was accepted in Melbourne, and after training, he embarked for war at the end of December 1940, arriving in Palestine just over a month later. Mario was posted to the 2nd 3rd Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment as gun layer, being the man responsible for aiming the massive gun at targets such as enemy planes. Though his posting got off to a rocky start with more than a week in hospital with dysentery, Mario was well liked and respected in his unit. By the end of April, Mario was again shipped out from Palestine, this time to Greece, where he served at Crete. On the 20th of May 1941, the day the German invasion of Crete began, he was the layer on No. 3 gun of Sea Troop, defending the vital aerodrome at Heraklion. The gun brought down 1 German plane and scored hits on 2 others. The men fought until they were out of ammunition, but by this time their position was cut off by German troops. With no other option, they escaped to a rowing boat and pulled out to sea. After 5 hours, Mario and the men were rescued by the British destroyer Kingston, who battled through the German Luftwaffe and deposited them at Alexandria. While Mario was fighting for Australia in foreign countries, his family were fighting to stay out of internment camps at home. Mario's mother, brother, and sister, having been born in Japan, were required to register as enemy aliens. Around 4,000 Japanese, including Japanese Australians, were imprisoned during the war. Unlike German and Italian Australians, who were selectively interned and largely consisted of adult men, a more blanket approach was taken to the internment of Japanese. Australian-born citizens with Japanese heritage, young children, and even Australian spouses were interned in camps, along with elderly residents who had been in Australia since before the White Australia policy. Many were deported to Japan after the war. Documents in Mario's records show how his war service played a large part in his mother remaining free from the internment camps. However, his brother Sho was not so fortunate. Unlike Mario, Sho was Japanese by birth, and the military was unwilling to consider him for service. He was interned as a result. The local community fought hard for his release, with some members going so far as to testify on the family's behalf at the Aliens Tribunal. Sho is described in the tribunal minutes as being as loyal a citizen as any living in our district, always willing to help. And the family reputation was absolutely one of the best. Mario's sister Aiko was a primary school teacher in the Swan Hill district, and the Swan Hill Police Force felt ashamed and embarrassed at the prospect of arresting the family. They sought advice from the Attorney General about circumventing the regulations. These examples of community involvement led to Sho Takasaka being released and allowed to remain within a 14-kilometre radius of his farm. Meanwhile, Mario's exemplary service at Crete earned him a promotion to bombardier, making him a non-commissioned officer. He also received a written commendation from his general officer in commanding after taking part in rescue operations after a head-on collision between a troop train and a local train at Gaza in February 1942. Soon after, he was recalled to Australia as Japan entered the war and questions were asked by higher command of Mario's character and allegiances. Attempts were made to keep him in the rear and away from the front, but his commanding officer sent a report in April of 1942 which detailed his support for Mario. The above-named soldier has been under my command since joining the AIF, and I have no hesitation in stating that he is above suspicion. He is most popular with the men in his battalion, and the recent declaration of war against Japan has in no way affected his popularity or his ambition to serve. This report convinced higher command of Mario's allegiance to Australia, as no further action necessary is noted at the bottom of the page. Mario returned to Australia in May 1942 and undertook further training in artillery, leading to another promotion to sergeant. His war was not yet done, however. In October 1943, his unit again embarked to serve abroad, this time at New Guinea. After 5 months, Mario returned to Australia, stationed in Queensland after having contracted malaria in the tropics and spent some time recovering in hospital. As the war wound down, Mario spent most of 1945 as an artillery instructor in New South Wales. His official discharge came on the 22nd of August, and Mario returned to civilian life, where he engaged in various agricultural occupations. He married in 1948, then purchased an apple-growing block at Tyab on the Mornington Peninsula, and resided there for approximately 30 years. Upon his retirement, he moved to Peterhead in South Australia, and lived for the next 23 years. In 1993, the people of Swan Hill erected a small monument on the site of the Takasaka's original pioneering rice farm. Mario was the last living member of his generation in Australia, but he joined the ceremony with some of his nephews and nieces. He was by this time around 83 years old. 6 years later, he passed away in South Australia. Mario now rests in Centennial Park, Adelaide, with a serviceman's headstone. Although subjected to inequality in their own country at the time, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples served as part of Australia's Defence Forces during World War II. At the start of the Second World War, Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islanders were allowed to enlist, and many did so. But in 1940, the Defence Committee decided the enlistment of Indigenous Australians was neither necessary nor desirable, partly because white Australians would object to serving with them. However, when Japan ended the war, the need increased for manpower and forced the loosening of restrictions. Torres Strait Islanders were recruited in large numbers, and Indigenous Australians increasingly enlisted as soldiers and were recruited or conscripted into Labour Corps. John Stuart Murray, known as Stuart, was born on the 26th of October 1922 at Lake Boga, Victoria. Son of Barappa Barappa, Yorta Yorta, Wiradjuri man Sydney John Murray, a labourer, and his Wamba Wamba, Djudjurawa wife Hilda Zenobia, née Stuart, both born in New South Wales. Stuart, as he was known, had the tribal name of Werramanda, or Whistling Spear, handed down by his mother's people. His cultural totem was Burapak, the catfish. His tribal language totem was Waran, the black cockatoo with red feathers. Educated at Lake Boga State School, Stuart travelled surrounding districts as a teenager, rabbiting and fishing with his grandfathers at Lake Boga. One of his earliest experiences with racism came in the form of being refused entry at the local school in Balranald. The need for an education forced him to move to Mildura, where he boarded with an aunt in order to attend school. While living on the island, a settlement on the Murrumbidgee River at Balranald, New South Wales, he visited his father's relatives at the Cummariggunja Aboriginal Station, rode his racing bicycle along the roads of the Riverina, and hitched rides on goods trains. Moving to Melbourne in 1939, he worked in a bicycle factory at Brunswick. Giving his occupation as stockman and motor mechanic, Stuart enlisted in the Australian Imperial Forces on the 17th of December 1941 in Melbourne. Over the next year of training, he had a run of illnesses that caused him to be hospitalised, including typhoid, tonsillitis, nephritis, and inflammation of the kidneys, and later, the amputation of a toe. Arriving in Papua New Guinea in December 1942, Stuart served with the 2nd 12th Battalion. The 2nd 12th successfully attacked Europa Point on New Year's Day 1943, despite losing 63 men killed and 122 wounded. After this, the battalion took part in further actions around Sanananda, where they suffered a further 61 men killed in action. The battalion's involvement in the fighting lasted until late January 1943, when it was withdrawn to Saputo by road, and then by air to Port Moresby. In early March, the battalion returned to Australia aboard the transports Taruna and Motsayuka. Stuart was hospitalised for almost 2 months with unknown fevers, and then diagnosed with malaria while back in Australia. After a period of rest, training and reorganisation, the 2nd 12th Battalion headed back to Papua New Guinea, disembarking in Port Moresby in August 1943. On the last day of the year, the battalion was committed to the fighting in the Finisterre Mountains. Throughout early 1944, the 2nd 12th was involved in the fighting around Shaggy Ridge, where they undertook several attacks to the north of the ridge, around the Prothero 1st and 2nd features between the 21st and 24th of January. Through this time, Stuart suffered from malaria, with 4 more hospitalisations, the last being an evacuation by field ambulance to hospital and then back to Brisbane in May 1944. After almost a year of recuperation, Stuart embarked again, this time to Morotai and on to Borneo, where he was transferred to the 65th Infantry Battalion. In November 1945, he was promoted to Lance Corporal, but in January reverted back to private at his own request. Returning to Australia, he was discharged from the AIF in March 1946 due to his mother being seriously ill. Back at Lake Boga, Stewart worked as a painter. On the 30th of May 1947, at the Church of Christ Manse, Northcote, he married Nora Nichols, the daughter of Howard and Gladys Nichols and the niece of pastor Sir Douglas Nichols. Harsh flood conditions and the need for work led the couple to move to Melbourne in the mid-1950s. First to Camp Pell, a former American military base in Royal Park, and then to a Housing Commission estate at Glenroy, where they were the only Aboriginal family. Stewart lived the rest of his life in Glenroy, and the ownership of the house still remains with his family today. With Nichols as his mentor, Stewart became active in promoting Indigenous rights. He was a founding member of the Victorian Aborigines Advancement League in 1957 and was appointed its liaison officer in 1970 and director in 1972. Elected in 1969 to the new Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Council, he promptly resigned in protest at the state government's impositions on its composition and proceedings. An early supporter of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, in 1970 he became convener of the State Tribal Council and Victorian representative on the National Tribal Council. With others, he founded the Aboriginal Legal Service in Fitzroy in 1972, and in 1974 to 1975 worked as a senior liaison officer with the Victorian Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. A vigorous campaigner for land rights, Stewart was appointed to the first Victorian Aboriginal Land Council in 1975. While administrator from 1979 to 1985 of Dandenong and District Aboriginal Cooperative Limited, he led claims for former Aboriginal reserve land in Collingwood and more successfully fought to retain the Lake Tyers and Framlingham reserves. He also worked for Aboriginal Hostels Limited in Victoria. In 1982, he became Victoria's second Aboriginal Justice of the Peace, and in 1984 was awarded the Order of Australia Medal. In that year, he established the Victorian Aboriginal Funeral Service, reflecting his belief that to respect the dead was to respect the living. Driving the hearse himself, he ensured that Indigenous people who died in Victoria were returned home and given a decent burial. Although sometimes uncomfortable with pseudo-academic radicalism in the Aboriginal movement, Stewart was often in the news. In 1985, he took on the Victorian Returned Servicemen's League over the right of Indigenous soldiers to march together on Anzac Day, rather than in their respective battalions. He and others organised their own public remembrance march at Fitzroy and Northcote. In 1988, he joined in petitioning the Premier, John Cain, for just compensation and a treaty settlement. And in 1989, he was actively involved in a major dispute with Murray Downs Golf and Country Club, Swan Hill, over the desecration of Wamba Wamba burial sites. Of medium height, John Stewart Murray kept fit and feisty. He was a keen sportsman playing football and cricket, and in the 1970s he became secretary of the newly formed Victorian All-Stars Aboriginal football team that played in the National Aboriginal Football Carnivals from 1969 to 1980. In 1987, he was named the National Aborigines and Islanders Day Observance Committee's Victorian of the Year. Always a prolific letter writer and community activist, he spoke as straight as a spear and never stopped being a soldier and warrior for his country and people. Survived by his wife and their 3 daughters and 5 sons, he died of myocardial infarction on the 1st of June 1989 at his Glenroy home and was buried at Lake Boga Cemetery in his beloved Gormjanyuk clan's Wamba Wamba First Nations country with his mother, grandparents, uncles and aunties. Thomas Arthur Waldron, known as Tommy, was the youngest child of 7, born at Chinkapook on the 9th of February 1922. He attended school locally, and his mother described him as having an excellent ear and vamped what he chose on the piano. Tommy was deeply religious, but he was an all-rounder and enthusiastic at work, sport or a local hop. But drink or smoke, he would not. After finishing school, Tommy found the family farm engulfed in drought and money tight. He decided to join the Royal Australian Navy and was just 18 years old as he signed up on the 30th of January 1941 to be a stoker, second class. A stoker was primarily responsible for transporting and shoveling coal to the ship's furnaces. Coal-fired boilers required a constant feed to keep temperatures high enough to produce steam. Tommy first spent a month training at the HMAS Lonsdale Naval Base in Port Melbourne. From here, he spent the next 5 months at the Royal Australian Naval College at HMAS Cerberus, 70 kilometres from Melbourne near Crib Point, Western Port Bay. Finally, on the 20th of August 1941, Tommy had his first ship posting on the HMAS Gunbar. The Gunbar was requisitioned for war service from the North Coast Steam Navigation Company of Sydney. She was used in minesweeping operations out of Fremantle on the west coast. Tommy was struck down with measles within a couple of months of this posting and was removed from the ship for medical care. He eventually recovered and was assigned to a new ship, this time a light cruiser named HMAS Sydney II, which was tasked with escorting troop ships from the port at Fremantle. He joined the crew on the 30th of August 1941. On the afternoon of the 19th of November 1941, the HMAS Sydney II was off the coast of Western Australia near Carnarvon, heading south towards Fremantle. Around 1555, the cruiser spotted a merchant ship on a northbound course, which quickly turned away from the coast. Sydney II increased speed and made to intercept. As she closed the gap, Sydney began to signal the unidentified merchantman. The merchant ship hoisted her call sign, which was that of the Dutch ship Straat Malacca, but she was not on Sydney II's list of ships meant to be in the area. Further flag signals were exchanged between the ships, with Sydney asking the Dutch ship's destination and cargo. Sydney II's main guns and port torpedo launcher were trained on the ship, while she sent part of Straat Malacca's secret call sign, waiting for the full code to be returned. Straat Malacca had not replied because she was, in fact, the German auxiliary cruiser Cormoran in disguise. And when asked to reveal a call sign the Germans did not know, Cormoran responded by raising a German flag and opening fire. Prompted by the raiders' unveiling, Sydney II also fired. But while her first salvo either missed or passed through the Cormoran's upper superstructure with minimal damage, 4 of the Cormoran's 6 15-centimetre guns were able to destroy the cruiser's bridge and gun director tower. It is likely that the captain of Sydney II and many of his senior staff would have been on the bridge and were either killed or badly wounded in this first salvo. Sydney II was able to put multiple shells into Cormoran, damaging machinery spaces and one of the raiders' guns while igniting an oil tank. During this, Cormoran maintained heavy fire before a torpedo it had launched at the start of the engagement hit Sydney just forward of a turret, ripping a hole in the ship's side and causing the bow of the cruiser to angle down. Down by the bows, the cruiser swung hard to port and passed behind Cormoran. By 1735, Sydney was heading south and losing speed, wreathed in smoke from multiple fires. The Australian cruiser continued on a south-southeast heading at low speed. At some point during the night, Sydney II lost buoyancy and sank. Sydney II shells had crippled Cormoran. The German sailors abandoned ship after it was determined that the below-deck fires could not be controlled before they reached the gun magazines or the mines in the cargo hold. The raider was scuttled at midnight. Sydney II's failure to reach Fremantle on the 20th of November was not initially cause for concern. However, with no sign of the cruiser by the 23rd of November, shore-based wireless stations began transmitting orders for Sydney II to break silence and report in. A raft of German survivors was recovered by a British tanker on the 24th of November, at which point a large-scale air and sea search began. During the search, which lasted until the evening of the 29th of November, 318 survivors from Cormoran's 399 personnel were found. But apart from a Carly float and a lifebelt, nothing from Sydney 2 or the 645 aboard, including Tommy, was recovered. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin officially announced the loss of the cruiser during the afternoon of the 30th of November. Sydney's destruction was a major blow to Australian morale and military capability. Her ship's company made up 35% of the Royal Australian Navy's wartime casualties. After many attempts, Sydney 2 was finally located on the 17th of March 2008. News that the cruiser had been found was announced by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd over 66 years after the Sydney 2 sank with all 645 souls on board. Tommy's sister, Ellen, told a newspaper at a 2008 memorial of the heartbreak her family suffered. Our sister, Mavis, was the telephonist at the Chincopuck Exchange. That's how the family got the news. It was awful. Afterwards, our father was always looking out down the laneway, waiting for our brother to come back to the farm. Tommy was just 19 when he lost his life on the HMAS Sydney. Some families had many members serving abroad at the same time. Mac, Alf, Jim and Ray Coombe had a rougher start than most in life. Born to James, known as Fard, and Eleanor Coombe, the boys were toughened by their family life long before joining the war effort. Their father had enlisted to fight in World War I in 1916, leaving the family of 4 children and wife home alone. Fard was medically discharged and pensioned out of the army on a £1 a week pension when he returned at the end of the war. He suffered from damaged lungs due to gas and what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. The PTSD resulted in Fard developing a heavy drinking habit when he had the money, and especially when drunk, was afflicted with a very erratic temper. Though he was very ill, he decided to apply for a soldier settlement block in 1921 in the new farming area at Coolanong. The farm was Virgin Mallee country and needed clearing, which involved the kids staying home from school while Fard convalesced and helped when he could. Mac stayed on to help and look after his siblings into the 1920s, but also finished up doing much of the work to clear the Coolanong block. Mac was also vested with the responsibility of providing whatever food he could scrounge, mainly rabbits, for the table. The tough conditions in Coolanong meant the farming didn't work out, so the block was sold for very little and the family moved down to Wandin, near Melbourne, around 1926. The kids quite often went to school without having had breakfast, as food was scarce in the house. They shifted into a number of houses around Wandin, but moved back up to the Coolanong area around Christmas 1929. The Depression was affecting every family by this time, and the kids were required to find jobs locally around the Boundary Bend area. Eventually, Alf acquired a butcher's shop in Coolanong, and the family moved into the adjoining house in town. On the 19th of June 1940, at the age of 35, the eldest brother, Mac, enlisted at Caulfield. He listed himself as single and a labourer. After his training, he was posted to the 2nd 24th Battalion and shipped off to the Middle East. He served in Tobruk, where there were 14,000 Australian troops at the time. Upon landing, Mac was taken straight from the ship to hospital, suffering from measles. He recuperated for the next 14 days before rejoining his unit. Jim decided to enlist on the 14th of March 1941. He was trained as an orderly in the Australian Army Medical Corps before being transferred to the Royal Australian Army Ordnance Corps and training at Puckapunyal. When Jim arrived in the Middle East in September 1941, he was immediately hospitalised for 4 days with nerves, before being discharged to his unit. After a bout of appendicitis, Jim was working in a mechanic workshop when an accident resulted in the loss of his right middle finger. Not long afterwards, he was returned to Australia, arriving in Melbourne in August 1942. Meanwhile, Mac had been designated as a unit sniper, being a good shot from his days on the farm. It was whilst on patrol on the 3rd of May 1941 that he was captured by Italian troops. Mac accompanied the patrol and then left to take up a sniper position, expecting the patrol to pick him up on their return. Instead, he was surprised by an Italian patrol and taken prisoner. He was kept for a short while in the Middle East and then transferred to a POW camp close to the city of Udine in northern Italy on the 11th of March 1942. Udine was in the foothills of the Alps, close to the Yugoslavian border. He was there for more than a year, until the Allied invasion of Italy at Salerno and Taranto on the 3rd of September 1943. The Germans took charge of the POWs and transferred them to camps in Germany in early 1944. First to Stalag 8A, located just to the south of the town of Gorlitz in Lower Silesia, east of the River Neisse. At the time Mac was held there, the camp housed approximately 47,000 POWs. But as the front came closer to Gorlitz, the camp was evacuated and Mac was taken to another camp called Stalag 344, located near the small town of Lambsdorff in Silesia. Mac was interned there until early 1945 when, on arising for their normal day's work, the prisoners saw that the guards had gone and the gates were open. Whilst exploring the area, they came across a partly bombed mansion. Upon entering, they found the colonel in charge of their camp deceased. Mac was repatriated to England in May 1945 and then on to Australia, and after rest and checks was discharged on the 30th of August 1945. Only a few days after his brother was captured, Alf enlisted on the 21st of May 1941. After 3 weeks of training, he was posted to Syria to work in the maintenance workshop. He was then reposted back to Australia in 1943 and given the option of going further in the maintenance division or joining the Paratroop Corps, which ultimately resulted in his being invited to join the newly forming Z Special Unit. Predominantly Australian, Z Special Unit was a specialist reconnaissance and sabotage unit including British, Dutch, New Zealand, Timorese and Indonesian members, predominantly operating on Borneo and the islands of the former Netherlands East Indies. Before joining the unit, Alf took the opportunity to take 3 days leave to get married. He took the train to Nile West and married his sweetheart Merle on the 10th of October 1944, followed by a 2-day honeymoon before being sent back to Maryborough for specialist training. Alf's first task in Z Special Unit was to go to Fraser Island and get the island set up to start the training of Z crews in preparation for their covert missions. Unit members went through extensive night raid training, parachute water drop training into Lake Mackenzie, mines, watercraft and so on. During this time, the youngest Coombe brother, Ray, had enlisted to serve in 1941 at 19 years old, but was not called up for active duty until 1943. He joined the 37th 52nd Battalion, and after almost a year of training in Queensland and marrying his wife Alma, Ray embarked for service abroad. He arrived at Milne Bay, codenamed Fall River, in Papua New Guinea on the 4th of April 1943, and his battalion joined the 4th Brigade against the Japanese in the Huon Peninsula and the New Britain campaigns. His nephew remembers Ray reminiscing about his war years. He said he didn't think he was a very tough soldier. He just did his bit with his mates, which included contracting malaria and dengue fever together, which he was not hospitalised for. In the last couple of months of the war, he was invited to join the Z Special Force with Alf. Again, he said he was concerned he wasn't as tough as Alf and Mac when it came to fighting the Japs, and wasn't sure he really deserved to be part of the Z Special. All 4 Coombe brothers made it through the war, though not unscathed. After his discharge, Mac came back to Swan Hill and lived for a while with his parents in the Bridge House on the New South Wales side of the Murray. He then took on the Mallee Mail Run and was married to his wife Pat on the 21st of April 1951. Mac and Pat moved to Lake Boga and lived in the ex-World War II dental hospital located on the main road from Swan Hill. He passed in 1984. Alf returned to Nile West and took a job with Bedinner's Machinery and Workshop as a mechanic. A year or so later, he and Merle decided to apply for a fruit block through the Soldiers Settlement Loan Scheme. They settled on a block at Goodnight, with only 7 acres of grapes planted. The family stayed in Goodnight for nearly 30 years before relocating to Sydney, where Alf took on a general maintenance job with a building supply company. Alf died at the age of 99 and a half. Jim returned to his wife in Swan Hill, where they took on the Tarax Bar in Campbell Street. While his wife took on responsibility for the bar, Jim had been appointed as a Horwood Bagshaw farm machinery salesperson. After moving south to Taradale and then Gisborne, Jim and his wife separated, and in 1965 Jim moved back to Swan Hill. After a motor vehicle accident, he moved down to Melbourne to be near his children, and after several years, passed away there. Ray also returned to his wife, Alma, and worked with her in her milk bar in Swan Hill. Ray and Alma then moved to their fruit block in Goodnight. But only 5 years or so later, Alma contracted a severe case of polio. Ray joined AMP as a sales rep, and they lived in Ballarat and Bendigo. Then, Ray got a promotion, and they moved to East Bentley and later Cheltenham in Melbourne. After Alma's death, Ray lived with his daughter and son-in-law until the age of 98. He passed away in March 2020, and his funeral was subject to COVID-19 restrictions.
Some families lost almost an entire generation to the war effort, leaving a painful reminder of the real cost of war. Henry Walter and Mary Elizabeth Hutchins and their 12 children lived at Wooreen North on the family farm from 1925. All the boys grew up helping their father around the property with pruning and picking grapes, as well as droving. Their main source of income was through the bartering system, exchanging produce for eggs, milk, lamb and vegetables. The family would all meet at Henry's and Mary's for Sunday night tea. The brothers would get out their mouth organs to join Dad Henry on accordion for a sing-along. They were a big, happy family of the time. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, their children ranged from 14 to 31 years of age, with some married and still living in the district. Alan was married to Edna with one daughter, Bev, and a son on the way. Bill was also married with one child, as was David, with 2 children and one on the way. Ivan, 25, William, known as Bill, 28, Malcolm, known as Mike, 29, and Alan, 22, all enlisted in June 1940 in Swan Hill. Ivan, Mike and Alan were all admitted for hospital stays within the first few months of Army life. Alan and Mike both contracted mumps, a swelling of the salivary glands, causing pain and difficulty swallowing. Alan also had recurring tonsillitis, so had his tonsils removed before embarking overseas. Ivan, Bill and Mike all served in the Middle East and survived their postings to return to Australia. Alan was posted to Rabaul in New Guinea, but was plagued with health problems, including malaria. 20 days after his last hospital release, Alan was listed as missing on the 25th of January 1942 in New Guinea. Meanwhile, at home, 3 more brothers had decided to enlist. Eric, 17, bumped up his age to 19 to join on the 26th of July 1941. And Fred also put his age up from 18 to 20. Big brother David, 28, joined to look after them. Fred and David trained together on the Adelaide River near Darwin, and here David was hospitalised with dengue fever. Nevertheless, he embarked less than 20 days after his release. Within 5 months, Japan had joined the war, and the 3 would be posted as replacements with C Company 2nd 21st Battalion, Gulf Force, to Ambon. A force of 1,131 Australians, without artillery or armour,
joined 2,500 poorly trained Dutch colonial troops to defend Lahar Airfield and the colony. On January 30th, 1942, the RAAF flew out, leaving the diggers to face an estimated 20,000 Japanese expected within hours. I have a letter Fred wrote to me saying they had no arms or ammunition, Mike wrote in the 1980s. They were doing guard duty with wooden guns. The meagre Gulf force defended Lahar Airfield, the diggers surrendering after 3 days of fierce fighting. Eric, who a year earlier had driven his parents mad to enlist, was among 300 troops murdered by the Japanese captors at Lahar in a series of massacres between February 6th and 20th. Most were beheaded to save on bullets. This was Eric's horrific fate. He was only 18 at the time of his death. His family were alerted that he was now classified as missing, but they were not aware of his death. All that was known of Fred and David was that they were prisoners of the Japanese at Ambon. Sister Myrtle later recalled that time. You never knew from one day to another what would happen, what sort of news you might get. You just hoped for the best. Ivan was discharged in June 1943, so he could take over the Wooreen North fruit property. Their parents had moved to Campbell's Creek near Castlemaine, all the time not knowing what had become of their 4 sons. Somehow, David and Fred kept each other going until just a few weeks before the war's end. They had survived more than 3.5 years of forced labour, malnutrition, disease and savage beatings from depraved guards. Survivors at Ambon's Tantui prison camp were used as slave labour on projects for the advancement of the Japanese army. Some returned survivors from Tantui credited Fred with saving their lives, telling stories of him stealing food from the camp guards and sharing it with his fellow prisoners to fend off starvation. A returned prisoner of war, Courtney Harrison, in his book Ambon, Island of Mist, described how Fred was ordered to join a work party building a kitchen on July 6, 1945, despite suffering from severe malaria and malnutrition. From the early morning, Ike Asor, the guard, began to punish him because of his inability to do much work. He received several beatings, the last being with a 3-star iron fence picket. He was knocked to the ground, where he was given further punishment. Ike Asor left him unconscious on the ground, from where one of his mates later carried him to the truck. He remained unconscious and died in the camp the following morning. No one knows what impact that had on David, but he also perished, officially of beriberi, a disease caused by a lack of thiamine, which leads to damage to the nervous system and heart. This was just 3 weeks after Fred's death, as the war was about to end. Not only did he never see his baby son, but he died not knowing that his 3 young children would be orphaned. David's wife Anne had died in Bendigo Hospital of tuberculosis in 1944. Wesley, Lorraine and Trevor Hutchins were raised by Anne's brother and his wife. Alan's wife Edna had received a telegram in December 1942, informing her the army believed he may have died of illness after the capture of New Britain. Alan had been among the 1,500 men of Lark Force, which, like Gulf Force, had been bombarded and then overrun by a huge Japanese invasion of 12,000 Marines in January 1942. The few survivors, who lived rough in the bush, then escaped on small boats. There are several schools of thought on what actually happened to Alan. A survivor told Mike Hutchins that Alan was suffering from dysentery, but had lasted in New Britain's jungles until March 31st, 1942, when he was shot and killed by a Japanese patrol. Another theory, which has recently come to light, is that Alan was captured. His name appears on a list of men who were loaded onto the Japanese auxiliary ship Montevideo Maru. Because it was unmarked as a prisoner of war transport ship, it was torpedoed by an American cruiser, unknowing that it was transporting Allied prisoners and civilians. The sinking is considered one of the worst maritime disasters in Australia's history.
A nominal list made available by the Japanese government in 2012 revealed that a total of 1,054 prisoners died on the Montevideo Maru, with no survivors. On February 24th, 1946, almost 4 years after he went missing, Alan's wife Edna finally received a telegram confirming his death from disease. The family may never know his true fate, and tragically, he died never meeting his newborn son. Myrtle can remember the local minister at her parents' house after the 3 telegrams about David, Eric and Fred had been delivered. Another sister, Mary, said the news almost killed her mother. Myrtle adds, Dad definitely changed. He sort of went quiet. The war wasn't discussed. I think there were changes in every one of us during and after the war. Her lost boys were never mentioned, but Mother Mary Hutchins wore an official brooch with 2 bars, a chain, and 7 gold stars until she died on the 20th of November, 1956. The surviving brothers felt bitterness towards the Japanese for what happened to their brothers, according to Sister Myrtle. Ivan had taken over the Wooreen North family property and later moved to a soldier settlement block at Robinvale, but died in 1969 after years of battling motor neurone disease. Mike married in 1944 and developed a fruit property in Katanga, but war service from New Guinea left the artilleryman stricken by pain from an excruciating peptic ulcer and severe nosebleeds. He had to wait until 1983, almost 40 years, for a full TPI pension. Bill's first wife, Grace, had left him for a Canadian who had been based at Lake Boga while he was away at war. She had left their son Desmond with Bill's mother Mary. When Mary became ill and could no longer care for Des, Alan's wife Edna took over his care. When Bill came home from war, he took on Alan's children as well as Des and raised them together with Edna. They finally married and had 4 more children. Myrtle recalls, he really looked after those kids and they brought them up well. They were a good couple, good for one another. For the rest of their lives, surviving brothers Mike, Bill and Ivan carried physical and psychological scars from war and their brothers' horrific fates. But they soldiered on. There are tragic stories of families who suffered terribly during World War I, but 4 fallen brothers on a World War II memorial is rare. Almost 1 million Australians, both men and women, served in the Second World War. They fought in campaigns against Germany and Italy in Europe, the Mediterranean and North Africa, as well as against Japan in Southeast Asia and other parts of the Pacific. The Australian mainland came under direct attack for the first time as Japanese aircraft bombed towns in northwest Australia and Japanese midget submarines attacked Sydney Harbour. The war created complex administrative, military, economic and industrial burdens for Australia. Of the total population of 7 million Australians, nearly 500,000 were engaged in munitions, or building roads or airfields, and over 1 million joined the armed services. Industry, commerce and the labour market were regulated. Prices and rents were fixed, and food, petrol and clothing were rationed. During the years of 1939 to 1946, 27,291 Australian men and women were killed and approximately 40,000 were wounded. One of the largest categories of casualties were the prisoners of war. Between 1942 and 1945, 22,576 Australians were taken prisoner by the Japanese, and only 14,256 survived the war. In the European sphere, of the 7,829 captured, 5,576 were alive when hostilities ended. These men and women often faced a life haunted by the horrors they had survived.
Help me, O God, when death is near, to mock the haggard face of fear, that when I fall, if fall I must, my soul may triumph in the dust, till I come back again. The nights are long and lonesome when I'm without you, dear. Your tender smiles and kisses make me wish that you were near. The hours pass by more slowly, but I know you'll wait for me till I come back to you again from far across the sea. Remember how we used to sit upon the old park seat, telling each other pretty things that were so nice and sweet. So, when the nightmare's over and the shores are safe again, I'll come back to you, my dear, if God spares me the pain. So keep your chin up, darling, and smile when things are blue. Just say a prayer each night for me till I come back to you.